By the time I had finished middle school, my parents trusted me to stay at home alone for extended periods, sometimes even for a few days. They would leave me in charge, primarily so I could take care of our elderly dog who needed constant attention and supervision. Occasionally, they'd go out of state for a small weekend trip, leaving me to manage things on my own. Fast forward to a crisp autumn evening. My parents had left early on a Friday morning, planning to return by Sunday night. Everything had been smooth sailing, and I was enjoying the rare luxury of having the house all to myself. Saturday rolled around, and I decided to bring my gaming console out into the living room, along with a few pillows and a blanket. Since my dog usually slept in the living room, I figured I'd sleep there too, just in case she needed me in the middle of the night. It was approaching dinner time, so after I fed the dog, I texted my mom, asking if she could send a bit of money for pizza. I wasn't in the mood to cook. Once I'd ordered the pizza, I settled onto the couch, playing a shooting game to pass the time. Eventually, I heard the doorbell ring. I quickly threw on my jacket and went to check through the peephole, where I saw the pizza delivery guy. It was a man of average height, probably in his mid-40s, with unkempt, dirty blonde hair and heavy bags under his eyes, as though he hadn't slept in days. The smell of cigarettes hung faintly in the air, and he wore an anxious expression, staring intently at the doorbell camera. I unlocked the door and opened it just enough to fit my body, greeting him with a smile. His eyes darted over to me, and a slow, unsettling grin stretched across his face. He greeted me with a comment about not expecting to see someone my age, his words sending a twinge of discomfort through me. Unsure how to respond, I let out a small, nervous laugh and extended my hands to take the pizza. He then asked how old I was, and I felt a spike of unease. I answered politely, saying I didn't share personal information like that. He seemed slightly annoyed by my response. As I handed him the tip I'd prepared, he asked if my parents were home. I lied, saying they were in another room, hoping the car still parked in the driveway would help sell the story. He made a vague comment about enjoying shooting games too, noticing the paused game screen behind me. Feeling increasingly uncomfortable, I tried to wrap things up politely, explaining that I needed to go. The man took the tip with a scowl, muttering something under his breath as he turned away. Just before I closed the door, I caught a snippet of his words, something like, "You're going to regret this." My anxiety rose as I locked the door and watched from the window to make sure he actually got back into his car. I kept an eye on him until he finally sped off around the corner. Letting out a sigh of relief, I made a quick round to double-check that all the doors and windows were securely locked. A couple of hours later, I decided to settle in for the night, lying down with the TV on, and soon dozed off, completely forgetting the unsettling encounter. I woke up abruptly to the sound of my dog barking frantically. It was around 2 a.m., and her barking wasn't the usual. It was the panicked, warning bark she used when she sensed a stranger. Anyone with a dog knows the difference. I sat up, stretching and scanning the room, but didn't notice anything unusual. I was about to lie down again when something in the corner of my vision caught my attention. In the window to my right, the same man from earlier was standing there, grinning at me with an eerie smile. He waved at me, his expression darkening, becoming more sinister by the second. My heart started racing, and a chill washed over me. Questions flashed through my mind. Why was he here? How long had he been watching me sleep? Filled with terror, I sprang up, my instincts screaming at me to act. I ran to my bedroom, grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed, and hurried back to the living room, clutching it tightly. But when I returned, he had moved to the front door and was now knocking lightly. From outside, I heard him call out, saying we should hang out and have some fun. My voice shook as I yelled back, warning that I'd call the police if he didn't leave. His response was a burst of violent anger as he banged on the door, shouting insults. My dog barked wildly, so I scooped her up and locked myself in my room. I quickly dialed 911. I whispered to the 911 operator, explaining the situation, while in the background, I heard the man throwing himself against the front door, attempting to break it down. I sent a quick text to my parents, who immediately packed up and started driving home. But those thoughts faded when I heard the loud crack of the front door giving way. Whispering to the operator, I told them he'd broken into the house. They advised me to stay hidden, promising the police were only minutes away. But before I could reply, my phone died, leaving me in silence. Fighting panic, I crept to my closet, shutting off the lights, and hid inside with my dog, trying to keep her calm so she wouldn't bark and give us away. Footsteps thudded through the house as the intruder searched each room, muttering curses to himself. When he reached my bedroom, I heard him testing the door handle, growing more frustrated by the second. He started pounding, and then there was the sound of something breaking, the unmistakable noise of him punching a hole through the door. He slipped his hand through the opening, unlocking the door with a faint click. My heart raced as he stepped into the dark room, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. I cupped my hand over my mouth to muffle my anxious breathing as he searched through my belongings, checking under the bed, the desk. Finally, he reached for the closet door. I braced myself, thinking, this is it. I'm dead. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew it couldn't be good. But just then, my silent prayers were answered as I heard the unmistakable sound of sirens, steadily growing louder. Damn it, he muttered, rushing out of my room. I heard him running through the house, then the sliding door opening and the crunch of footsteps on the dried grass outside. Moments later, a police officer opened the closet door, assuring me it was safe to come out. They escorted me outside, where I sat on the edge of the police car with my dog, watching as officers searched the house to make sure he wasn't hiding somewhere. The police confirmed nothing had been taken. He hadn't been looking for valuables. It was clear he had been there for me. That terrifying realization haunted me long after the incident, as the case stayed open but eventually went cold. Later, they identified him, revealing a history of warrants for home invasions and failing to appear in court. However, he was never apprehended. The fact that he's still out there somewhere haunts me to this day. I know one thing for certain. I'll never open the door for anyone when I'm home alone again. This experience took place when I was 13 years old. At the time, I lived with my father and older sister in a small duplex. It was a 2-bedroom setup where I shared a room with my dad, while my sister, who was 4 years older, had her own room. My father and sister often had plans in the evenings, so I'd usually be at home alone, engrossed in my favorite video games. That night was no different. My father was likely out socializing, and my sister could have been anywhere, knowing her. I spent hours playing the original Resident Evil on the PlayStation, immersed in the eerie atmosphere of the game. But eventually, the clock ticked past midnight, my eyelids felt heavy, and I decided it was time to head to bed. My bedroom door was always open when I slept. Not once in the years we'd lived there had either my father or sister ever entered through the back sliding glass door. On the rare occasions when my sister didn't have her key, she'd knock on my bedroom window, asking me to let her in. My father, on the other hand, always had his keys, and he'd always come in through the front door. That night, though, I heard the unmistakable sound of the back door sliding open. The old door's heavy, squeaky track meant it made a loud, distinct sound as it moved, and there was no mistaking it. I lay in bed, my eyes wide open as my imagination started running wild. I could hear footsteps moving through the dining room, into the kitchen, and then onward to the living room, with no attempt to be quiet. After a brief pause, I saw a shadow pass by my open doorway, casting a faint silhouette on the wall. My heart pounded as my mind grappled with the terrifying realization of someone in the house who shouldn't be there. Whoever this person was walked into the bathroom next to my bedroom and switched on the light. The light flooded into my room, exposing me fully, as I lay frozen and terrified in my bed. I knew it couldn't be my father or sister. Neither of them would have used the back door, and there was no one else who should have been there. It wasn't family, and I knew none of my friends would have come over unannounced, especially not at that hour. This was clearly someone unfamiliar, and everything in me knew they didn't belong. The person exited the bathroom, leaving the light on, and entered my sister's room. There was a loud clatter as if they were rummaging through drawers or tossing things around, searching for something. I lay motionless in bed, too scared to move or make a sound. Minutes passed like hours as I lay shivering, listening to the sounds of their movements through the thin walls. Eventually, they exited my sister's room and again passed my open doorway. I braced myself, expecting at any moment they'd turn and enter my room. But they didn't. Instead, they moved back to the living room, pacing slowly and audibly, with occasional deep sighs that sounded both frustrated and ominous. I started to notice a pattern in the movements. The person would walk into the bathroom, then back out, then pass my door again, as if they were repeatedly surveying the house. In the dim light, I could make out the figure's tall frame, which was obviously male. He continued circling through the rooms, moving from one to the other, yet oddly avoiding mine as though he knew I was there and was choosing not to enter. I couldn't fathom why he would go everywhere else. Every single room except the one where I lay frozen in fear. Then, as suddenly as he'd arrived, he made his way back through the house toward the back sliding door. I heard the door open, and he slipped away into the night, leaving the house as quietly as he had come. For a long while, I lay in bed, still and unnerved, wondering who that could have been and why they hadn't stepped into my room despite passing by it so many times. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my terror, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When morning came, my father and sister were both home as usual, with no indication that either of them knew what had happened. I asked them each countless times afterward, but they always insisted it hadn't been them. Besides, why would they go through the back door, wander the house in silence, and then leave the same way? That was 21 years ago, and the incident remains an unsolved mystery. Nothing was missing, no items displaced or stolen. Yet the experience left a lasting impact. What haunts me the most, even now, is the unsettling question. Why did he never enter my room? The door had been wide open, and he had walked by it over and over again, almost like he was taunting me. In 2019, I was in my second year of college living in a small townhome about a 10-minute walk from campus. I shared the place with two other girls, but since it was winter break, both had gone back to their family homes, leaving me alone. I worked in healthcare and had drawn the short straw that year, signing up to work over the Christmas holiday. To provide some context, there used to be 4 of us sharing the space, but one girl had moved out after complications with her boyfriend. He was the sort of guy who seemed to have no respect for anyone's boundaries. Originally, he was only supposed to visit occasionally, but he essentially ended up moving in without asking. Things escalated when one night, he became physically aggressive toward her and verbally abusive to the rest of us. After that incident, we told her that if she didn't kick him out, we'd have to bring it up with the landlord. Reluctantly, she moved out, and our friendship dissolved in the process. I knew what it was like to be in a harmful relationship, so for 2 years, I had tried to help her see the reality of her situation. But when it started impacting everyone's safety, she had to leave. On Christmas Eve, I went about my usual routine, prepping for bed early since I had a shift the next morning. I made sure to lock all the doors, switched off the lights, and went downstairs to my bedroom. After an hour or so of mindless scrolling on my phone, the clock ticked into Christmas Day. Just then, I heard a noise. It sounded like one of the kitchen chairs had been moved. My room was directly beneath the kitchen, so it was easy to tell where the sound came from. At first, I dismissed it, thinking it might just be the neighbors. We shared walls with them, and they sometimes made enough noise for me to hear it in my room. But then I remembered they'd asked me to bring in a package they were expecting because they'd gone home for the holidays. After a moment, the sound stopped, and I decided to ignore it. A few moments later, I felt my heart stop. My bedroom door started to open slowly. The memory of my second-grade teacher telling us about her own experience with a break-in flashed through my mind. She had once told us that if someone broke into your house, acting asleep could help keep you safe if they were only interested in stealing. But that plan went right out the window when I looked down and saw the light from my phone illuminating my face in the dark. My heart pounded as I saw a man standing in the doorway, with one foot inside the room. All I could make out was a shadowy figure wearing a backward baseball cap, but the situation was clear. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, although it was probably only a few seconds. My mind raced, thinking of every possible outcome, but all I could do was remain frozen. Slowly, he backed out of the doorway, closing the door softly behind him. In that silent, surreal moment, I sat there in shock, trying to process what had just happened. I knew I needed to call the police, but a part of me hesitated, afraid it would trigger a notification on my parents' phones. They would see that I had called 911, and I didn't want to worry them. On top of that, I feared he might still be somewhere in the house, listening for any sound I made. Instead, I texted the guy I had been seeing at the time, telling him that a stranger had just broken into my room. He immediately urged me to call the police, snapping me out of my paralyzed state. When I finally dialed 911, the dispatcher asked if I felt safe enough to go upstairs and unlock the door for the officers, so they wouldn't have to break it down. I told her there was no way I was going up there alone, and I didn't care if the door was damaged. Minutes later, flashlights illuminated my window, and I heard officers knocking and announcing themselves. One of them came to get me while the others began to search the house. It felt surreal, like one of those scenes in a crime show where officers sweep rooms with weapons drawn. After a thorough search, they didn't find anyone, and surprisingly, nothing appeared to have been taken. They attempted to dust for fingerprints but couldn't lift anything clear enough. When they asked me about the back door, they said it was unlocked with no signs of forced entry. This detail puzzled me because I was certain I had locked it. I spent the rest of the night with my boyfriend at the time, who kept me company, but I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. I kept pacing through the house, checking every door and window repeatedly. I ended up placing chairs under each door handle for an extra layer of security, even on my bedroom door. The next day, I reported the break-in to the landlord, hoping she would change the locks, but she refused. She never replaced the locks the entire time we stayed there, leaving us to worry every night until we eventually moved out. Since that incident, I developed a habit of checking the doors multiple times before bed, no matter where I am. Reflecting on it later, I wondered if it could have been our former roommate's boyfriend. He might have kept a key, given how frequently he had stayed with us. But the whole encounter remained a mystery. If it were him, why didn't he say or do anything? And if it was someone else, why didn't they steal anything? I was home alone that morning, preparing for my 12 o'clock college class, when I decided to open the blinds to let in some natural light. As I did, I noticed a man, probably in his mid-30s, wearing a baseball cap and moving around my property with an odd sense of purpose, his hands planted firmly on his hips. There was a strange confidence in his walk, almost like he had a right to be there. Our yard sits on a kind of cliff overlooking a stretch of our 5-acre property down below, offering a scenic view typical of the northern forests where I live. At first, I thought he might be someone my parents hired for renovations on the house, just taking a moment to enjoy the view. But as I watched him, I started feeling a little uncomfortable. He was no longer in view, having moved toward the side of the house, so I went upstairs to get a better look. Now he was in the front yard, meandering around the driveway, scanning the surroundings and examining the house closely. He hadn't noticed me watching him. Uncertain, I decided to call my dad and ask if he knew of anyone who was supposed to be working around the house. My dad sounded surprised, said he wasn't aware of anyone coming by, but promised to check with my mom and call me back. As I waited, I noticed his car parked near the house. A white sedan, maybe a Honda with no license plates. Something about that car unsettled me even more. The man still seemed oblivious to my presence and continued wandering around, so I took the opportunity to activate our security system. If he tried to enter, the alarm would trigger and notify the authorities. If he was a legitimate worker, he would have probably knocked on the door or rung the bell at least once. But he hadn't. Just then, my dad called back to confirm that neither he nor my mom had arranged for anyone to come by and instructed me to call the local police station immediately. I double-checked the locks on every door and window upstairs before going back downstairs to make the call. I explained the situation to the woman who answered, but she said she wouldn't be sending an officer, Instead, she gave me a number to call their emergency dispatch line. I dialed the number only to hear an automated message informing me that it was the non-emergency line and that no one was available. If it was an emergency, it advised me to hang up and call 911. Frustration set in as the minutes ticked by and this stranger continued lurking around my house while I was alone, and apparently that wasn't considered urgent. I finally called 911, feeling this warranted an emergency response. The dispatcher asked me several questions about his appearance before contacting nearby officers. The delay felt odd. It was as though no one considered this an emergency, even though I was a young woman alone at home with a strange man outside. Finally, the dispatcher said officers were on the way and allowed me to stay on the line. I went back upstairs to check on the man, who was now sitting in his unmarked car. There was a loud male voice coming from inside his car, either a radio show or maybe a phone call on speaker, filling the quiet morning air. Suddenly, the line went dead with that tone you hear when someone hangs up. A moment later, my phone rang with an unrecognized number. Assuming it was the dispatcher trying to reconnect, I answered. Instead, a heavy, eerie breathing greeted me, filling me with a deep unease. I hung up immediately and dialed 911 again, feeling the first waves of panic. The new dispatcher already knew my address and situation before I could even explain, telling me that officers were on their way. By now, 20 minutes had passed, and although I lived in a small town, the response time seemed unusually long. At last, the stranger began pulling out of the driveway just as the police arrived. The officers intercepted him and seemed to ask him a few questions before one of them came up to my door. He handed me a cheap, faded flyer and explained, almost dismissively, that it was just a landscaper, saying the man claimed to have an appointment. I was relieved but confused and irritated that he hadn't approached the house at all if he really was a landscaper. Just to confirm, I called my mom, who quickly clarified the situation. She assured me they hadn't hired any landscapers, nor did we need one. The whole encounter left me unsettled, knowing someone had lied their way out of being questioned. Several years ago, I was living with a former partner in a house we had just moved into. It was a cozy 2-bedroom place, and we were gradually making it our own. We decided to turn the second bedroom into an office because the house had only one bathroom, which could only be accessed through that room. Since we often had friends crash on our sofa, we thought it would be best for them to have a more direct route to the bathroom rather than going through our bedroom in the middle of the night. About a month after moving in, something unsettling happened. My partner was out with colleagues one night, leaving me home alone. I spent most of the evening curled up on the sofa with takeout, watching TV. Now and then, I caught odd noises here and there, faint enough that I couldn't quite place what I was hearing. I brushed them off as typical house sounds or maybe my nerves acting up. When it got late, I went upstairs to the small office to spend a little time on my computer before bed. We hadn't gotten the phone line installed yet, and my prepaid cell phone was out of credit, leaving me without any way to contact anyone if I needed to. Sitting in the back bedroom with only a dim table lamp lighting the room, I became more attuned to my surroundings. As I typed away on my laptop, I heard another noise. This time, a faint, rattling sound. I turned off my music, straining to determine whether it was real or just my imagination. I stepped into our bedroom, glanced down at the front door, but there was no one there. Then, I peeked through the back window, which overlooked our small yard bordered by a tall brick wall and a sturdy wooden gate. The darkness was thick, and there was no light outside to make anything out, but from what little I could see, there was no movement. Reassured, I went back to the office and tried to settle in again. Barely 10 minutes later, I heard another sound, like metal scraping against metal. It was eerie and low, as though someone was deliberately trying to keep quiet. My unease grew, and I found myself inching towards the closet in our bedroom where we had found an old, heavy iron rod left by a previous tenant. Without turning on any lights, I grasped the rod, not wanting to alert anyone to my presence if someone was indeed there. With no way to call for help, The fear of a potential intruder creeping around the house made my pulse race. Moving carefully back into the office, I closed the door and, as silently as possible, bolted it and wedged a chair under the handle. I sat there for a long stretch, counting the minutes in near silence, convincing myself I had overreacted. It was, after all, my first night alone in the house, so maybe I'd been jumpier than usual. I left the music off, though, which turned out to be a smart choice, as I soon heard what sounded like two voices muffled and whispering. They were both low and masculine, but the voices didn't seem to be coming from inside. I had left the office window slightly ajar, and the sound drifted in from the alley behind our yard. Curiosity and dread compelled me to inch toward the bathroom, hoping for a clearer view of the alley that backed onto our property. The bathroom extended out slightly, creating an L shape with the yard, which allowed a better vantage point. I carefully climbed onto the ledge and nudged the bathroom window open, listening intently. The whispering was now unmistakable and coming from directly behind my gate. I couldn't hear complete sentences, but I made out enough to realize these men had been watching us since we moved in. They seemed to be aware of the valuables we had: cameras, computers, and other equipment. Judging by their tone and the context, it was clear they thought I was home alone and were just waiting for me to fall asleep. I perched on the ledge, clutching the iron rod with my heart pounding. Then a thunderous thud shattered the silence as one of the men threw himself against the gate, apparently abandoning any effort to be stealthy. The gate shuddered violently under the weight of the blows, and I could only imagine the size of the intruders. Being small and barely over 5 feet tall, the thought of confronting them terrified me. I tried to think of possible hiding spots, somewhere they wouldn't find me if they broke in. In the midst of my panic, a sudden, blinding light filled the yard. For a moment, I thought they'd brought a flashlight, and I ducked out of sight. But soon I realized it was the floodlight from a neighboring house, accompanied by loud barking and distant shouts. The light illuminated both my yard and the alleyway beyond, casting sharp shadows. Through the noise, I heard the men muttering curses and then the rapid sound of their footsteps retreating down the alley. I didn't leave that back bedroom until my partner stumbled in around 4 in the morning, oblivious to the night's events. I hadn't slept at all, and when I finally ventured outside at daybreak, I saw the gate barely hanging by one hinge, almost pried from the frame. Examining the lock, I found scratches around the keyhole, evidence that someone had tried to force it open. If it hadn't been for the neighbor's floodlight startling them, I can't bear to imagine what might have unfolded that night. I lived in the basement of my father's house when I was a teenager. He traveled frequently for work, often leaving me alone in the house for days on end, sometimes even a full week. As a result, I became accustomed to the quiet and in some ways even relished the independence. But every so often, I was reminded that being alone had its unnerving moments. One spring night, I stayed up late, comfortably nestled in the basement, watching TV. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard what I thought were footsteps outside. At first, I dismissed the noise, figuring it was an animal or some distant sound. But then, the distinct rhythm of 2 separate sets of footsteps became apparent. They echoed softly through the open windows as if someone, or more than one person, was walking from the front of the house, rounding the side, and eventually making their way into the backyard. Suddenly, it hit me that with all my lights on, I was visible from the outside, but I couldn't see a thing beyond the glass. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to turn off the TV and the lights, plunging myself into complete darkness. Alone in that basement, I sat still, frozen by fear, with what felt like prowlers just beyond the door, possibly lurking on the back deck. Time slipped by in silence. It might have been minutes or even longer, but after a while, I decided to investigate, hoping the footsteps I thought I heard were merely imagined. Quietly, I crept up the stairs, inching toward the main floor. Thankfully, all the lights upstairs were already off, but my heart pounded as I approached the windows. From the vantage point inside, I could make out portions of the backyard, but the way the bushes and patio umbrella were arranged left big blind spots in the very areas where I thought the footsteps had stopped. For a brief moment, I considered calling for help. But then I thought of my father. If he found out, he would probably make arrangements for me to stay with my aunt whenever he traveled, which was an idea I dreaded. So, I stood there, silently watching for any movement outside. Minutes ticked by as I waited, convincing myself that maybe I'd imagined it all. But doubt crept back in, and I knew I wouldn't be able to rest without checking outside. I grabbed the closest thing that could serve as a weapon. It was an old, worn shepherd's axe my dad kept as a keepsake. Then I cautiously went out through the front door, keeping close to the side of the house. I crouched behind one of the large bushes, feeling utterly exposed, yet determined to confront whatever might be out there. It took a moment to summon the courage, but finally, I raised the axe and swung it into the bushes in front of me, as though to scare off any potential intruders. Then I shouted, hoping to force any unwelcome visitors into revealing themselves. What I didn't expect was an immediate response. To my shock, I heard the unmistakable sound of deck chairs scraping against the wooden boards, followed by the hurried footsteps of two people bolting from the backyard. My pulse skyrocketed, and I felt a wave of dizziness from the adrenaline rushing through my veins. Without thinking, I darted back around the side of the house, my heart pounding louder than I could remember. All I could think was to get inside before they noticed me, so I dashed toward the front door, flinging it open, slipping inside, and slamming it shut. There I stood in the pitch darkness of the house, my breaths quick and shallow, feeling as though I had narrowly escaped a confrontation I wasn't prepared for. Peering through the front window, I searched for any sign of movement, hoping to catch sight of whoever had been in the yard. I expected to see them hurrying away, but no one appeared on the street. It dawned on me that, though I was now indoors, the sense of safety I craved had vanished. I felt confined, as if my own home had turned into a trap. In a surge of irrational bravery, I stepped back outside, leaving the house behind and moving into the middle of the quiet street. Out here, at least, I could scream if something happened. I berated myself for not having called the police immediately, but my mind was so jumbled with adrenaline and fear that rational thoughts seemed foreign. Turning back to look at my house, I scanned the yard and surrounding street once more, desperately searching for anyone out of place. Just when I was about to give up, I glanced to the left, then to the right. There, down the street, about a block and a half away, were two figures walking casually, as if nothing were out of the ordinary. As soon as I noticed them, they turned at the T-junction down the road and vanished from view. For reasons I couldn't fully explain, I started chasing after them. Rounding the corner, I was stunned to find the street completely empty. There was nowhere nearby that they could have disappeared to so quickly unless they had a vehicle hidden, ready for a quick getaway. The possibility chilled me, as it meant their appearance that night wasn't random. A few years back in my early 20s, I was studying in Madrid, Spain, and living on the city's quieter outskirts. My daily routine was set. I'd finish up at university, take a short bus ride, and then walk the rest of the way home. On one particular evening, as I headed home, I noticed an uncomfortable feeling creeping in, a sense of unease that intensified with every passing moment. There was a man on the bus, staring at me in a way that felt more predatory than curious. I was used to the occasional intrusive gaze, but this one felt far more menacing, like I was a target rather than just another passenger. Trusting my instincts, I decided to get off the bus a few stops early, hoping that by changing my usual routine, I could avoid him and keep my regular stop unknown to him. I waited until someone else pressed the button, then stood up at the very last moment and quickly exited. As I left, I glanced around, relieved to see no sign of him. The unease that had hung over me began to lift, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But just as I was beginning to feel secure again, I glanced back and saw him a few meters behind me. It seemed he had followed at a cautious distance, and I was gripped by the unsettling sense that he just averted his eyes as I looked. Instinct took over, and I ducked into a small corner shop, pulling out my phone to pretend I was on a call. I watched through the shop's windows until he was out of sight, then quickly resumed my walk, glancing back frequently in the bustling streets and crossing whenever I could to throw off his trail. By the time I reached my building, I'd convinced myself he'd lost interest or that following me had been nothing more than coincidence. Yet, as I approached the building's entrance, I turned for one final check, and there he was, standing on the opposite side of the street, looking directly at me with an unsettling smile. My heart raced, and I bolted up the stairs, skipping several at a time, and hurried into my apartment, locking the door behind me. My breathing was heavy, and I barely had a moment to compose myself when the intercom buzzed loudly. I don't know why I answered. The moment I did, I regretted it. Through the intercom, I could hear other flats ringing as well. He had pressed all the buttons, hoping for someone to grant him access. Then I heard my name. He knew it now, spoken in an unfamiliar, pleading voice, asking to be let in, assuring me he only wanted to talk. He suggested I come to the window and look down at him so I could see he wasn't a bad person. That suggestion jarred me. He wanted me to reveal my location. I hung up, heart pounding, my body frozen in place by the door, waiting in absolute silence. When I finally regained enough composure to think, I reached out to my long-distance boyfriend. His advice was immediate. I should call the police. But I hesitated, questioning if this was all worth the fuss, if maybe I was overreacting. In my uncertainty, I chose instead to call my best friend. Hearing her voice was the reassurance I needed to feel less alone. We talked for a long time until my nerves began to settle, and we even laughed at the oddity of it all. Then, just as I was beginning to relax, the intercom buzzed again. Nearly 2 hours had passed, yet he was still there. His voice came through once more, addressing me directly and requesting I let him in. The way he said it, coupled with the fact he had waited this long, sent chills down my spine. He claimed he was simply thirsty and asked for a glass of water, trying to sound harmless. But his persistence shattered any facade of friendliness. I quickly hung up, curling into a corner of the room, hoping he would tire of the game and leave. The intercom rang repeatedly, each ring feeling louder and more invasive than the last. I stopped answering, staying absolutely silent, barely daring to breathe. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep on the sofa, with one final ring piercing the silence in the middle of the night. When morning arrived, I was still shaken, afraid to open my door or even look out into the hall. My first call was to my dad. He didn't ask any questions, only said he'd be there soon. When he arrived, the hallway was empty, but there was a note in my mailbox. It was brief and chilling, with a simple message saying that he was a nice guy and I should have let him in. We went straight to the nearest police station to file a report, where the officers listened and assured me I should never hesitate to contact them in situations like this. My dad immediately arranged for a locksmith to install a code entry system at the building's main door, and he notified each neighbor, asking them not to admit anyone they didn't expect. For the next week, he and 2 friends sat at a cafe across from my building each evening, keeping an eye out for any sign of the stalker. I never saw him again, but that experience left its mark. I started taking a different route to and from university every day, never setting a pattern. My phone was always within reach, and I grew hyper-aware of everyone around me, checking behind me every few steps. To this day, I stay vigilant, never answering the door unless I know precisely who's there. To anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation, don't let self-doubt keep you from calling the police. I learned the hard way that trusting your instincts and erring on the side of caution is never an overreaction. The story took place when I was 22 years old. I had just arrived back from a long, exhausting night stocking shelves at a local grocery store. Working the closing shift meant I usually got home well past midnight. My roommate, Eric, and I shared a small, budget-friendly apartment in an area known more for its rough edges than its charm. But despite the neighborhood's reputation, I felt grateful for having my own space, one step removed from the familiarity of my parents' basement. Entering the apartment, I tossed my jacket onto the coat rack by the door and headed for the kitchen, feeling the pangs of hunger. Scanning through the sparse contents of the fridge, I grabbed a frozen burrito, thinking it would do the trick until I could get some real sleep. Then, as I passed the hallway, something caught my attention. My bedroom door was slightly ajar. Now, that may not sound strange at first glance, but I always closed my door when leaving for work. My personal space was important to me, even more so in a shared apartment. The sight of that door half open stirred a strange unease, a sense of something being off. Pausing near the living room, I looked down the dim hallway, feeling an inexplicable chill settle over me. I called out, a bit shakily, asking if anyone was there, but the silence felt heavier than usual. Unwilling to let nerves get the best of me, I crossed the living room and flipped on the hallway light. In my mind, I ran through possible explanations. Maybe Eric was trying to play one of his odd pranks on me. He had a knack for that. It wouldn't be the first time he tried to spook me by lurking around, waiting for the perfect moment to jump out. Resolving to just check, I cautiously approached my bedroom door, nudging it open with a slow push. The light from the hallway spilled in, casting familiar shadows over my small, twin bed, my nightstand, and the few belongings scattered across the floor. Everything looked normal, yet that strange, prickling feeling refused to fade. Trying to shake it off, I headed back to the kitchen, threw the burrito in the microwave, and pressed start, grateful for the reassuring hum of the appliance. To relax, I switched on the television, intending to distract myself with a good, spooky movie. Ironic as it was, given how rattled I already felt. Then, I heard it, a soft, muffled thump from the hallway. I brushed it off as noise from a neighbor who had been known to make the odd racket at night. But the sound repeated, slightly louder this time, and seemed to be coming directly from our hallway. Once more, I called out for Eric, hoping for some logical explanation. The microwave beeped suddenly, startling me. Then I heard Eric's voice through the closed bedroom door, saying he just dropped something. His response gave me a bit of relief, knowing he was home after all. Just as I reached for my heated burrito, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a text notification. It was from Eric. He'd written that he was running late at work and asked if I could leave the door unlocked for him. I felt my stomach clench as a chill crept over me. I texted him back, asking if he was sure he wasn't home. Eric responded almost immediately, confirming he was still at work and asking why I'd asked. As I stared at his message, another sound came from down the hall. My eyes slowly lifted toward the hallway, and there, in the half-lit space, stood the figure of a large man. The dim glow barely illuminated him, but the glint of a butcher's knife was unmistakable in his hand. My instinct to flee kicked in. I bolted toward the front door, the heavy sound of the man's footsteps echoing behind me. He wasn't running. Rather, his steps were slow and deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. I didn't dare look back, charging down the emergency stairs and bursting out into the cold night air of the parking lot. There, I immediately dialed 911, my hands shaking as I tried to relay what had just happened. The police arrived swiftly. After I told them everything, they went upstairs to search the apartment. They found no one, but they did discover something else. On the kitchen table, pinned under a salt shaker, lay a small note. The sight of it made my blood run cold as I stood there, the officers by my side. On that note was a single word, written in jagged, almost angry letters. Soon. To this day, the memory of that night lingers, unsettling and persistent, a reminder of how close I'd come to something I don't like to dwell on. Back in 2009, I spent a night home alone while my parents were out on one of their usual date nights. They often stayed out later than planned, sometimes because they had a few too many drinks at dinner and dozed off at the movies. That particular night was a humid August evening. I'd just returned from a long, tiring jog and was drenched in sweat. Since our old house didn't have air conditioning, the air felt thick and stagnant. To get some circulation going, I opened a few windows. I opened one in the kitchen, another two in the living room on opposite sides, and even cracked one in the basement, figuring I'd spend my evening there where it was much cooler. After a cold shower, I changed into some comfortable clothes and made my way downstairs to whip up a quick dinner. Once my meal was ready, I headed down to the basement, turned on Netflix, and settled in for a marathon of my favorite shows. At some point, I must have drifted off, though I couldn't recall exactly when. When I woke up, the room was pitch dark aside from the dim light of the TV casting a faint glow. A cold breeze swept through the basement, and I realized I'd left the window open too long. I got up, stretched, and walked over to close the window. I turned off the TV, gathered my dishes, and made my way upstairs. All the lights were off, so I knew my parents were still out. I washed the dishes, loaded them into the dishwasher, and closed the kitchen window above the sink. Just as I was about to head to my room, I remembered the 2 living room windows were still open. I walked over to the one by the TV, shut it, and moved to the second window near the front porch. When I reached the window, I noticed my mom's decorative vase on the table had been knocked over, scattering the fake flowers across the floor. I figured the evening breeze must have been strong enough to jostle the vase. As I bent down to pick up the flowers, a faint squeaking sound caught my attention. It was a soft, slow turn of a door handle. I paused, my ears straining to catch any other noise. A few moments later, I heard the floor creak lightly upstairs. A chill of anxiety started in my stomach, spreading upward as I froze in place. Still clutching the vase and flowers, I slowly straightened up. Peering out the front window, I looked to see if my parents' car was in the driveway. It wasn't. My heart sank. Carefully setting down the vase and flowers, I crept to the bottom of the stairs, listening for any more sounds from above. Approaching the stairs, I heard 2 more creaks on the upstairs floor. I stopped again, my breath shallow as I listened, but there was nothing further. I was only a few steps from the stairs. I reached out, gripping the railing, and glanced up into the shadowy hallway. Unsure of what to do, I weighed my options. Should I turn on the lights, risking alerting Eve or whatever might be upstairs? Should I leave the house and go to a friend's? Or maybe I should just call my parents and hope they would come home soon. Ultimately, I decided to put my phone on silent, retreat to the kitchen near the back door, and text my dad. After I messaged him, he replied, suggesting that the house was simply settling after a hot day. When I mentioned the sound of the door handle and the creaking floor, he reasoned that perhaps I had left a window open upstairs, allowing a draft to knock a door against its frame. His explanation eased some of my anxiety, though a small knot of worry remained. Feeling a little more at ease, I grabbed a glass of water and cautiously made my way upstairs. The light above the stairs bathed the hallway in a warm glow as I climbed, but a lingering unease nagged at me. Once at the top, I noticed something peculiar. All the doors were wide open, except for mine. My parents' bedroom, the spare room, and the den were all left ajar, while my own bedroom door was slightly cracked, as though a breeze had nudged it. Knowing my mom's habit of airing out the upstairs on hot days, I tried to calm my nerves. With a sigh of relief, I assured myself that my dad had been right. Stepping into my room, I switched on the light, did a quick check around, and set my glass of water on the nightstand beside my laptop. Then I headed to the bathroom to get ready for bed. I climbed under the covers, trying to let the familiar comfort of my bed soothe me. Watching reruns of Seinfeld on my laptop, I gradually felt myself start to relax. But just as I was drifting off, a soft scraping noise sounded from my closet door. Startled, I flicked on my bedside lamp and squinted at the closet. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness inside. I tried to remember if it had been open before. Was I just imagining things? Before I could fully process what was happening, an icy sensation prickled along my skin. A faint, chilling laugh echoed from inside the closet. My heart thudded wildly as I moved my laptop aside, barely breathing. Just then, the closet door flew open, and there, hidden among my hanging clothes, was a figure. In the dim light, I could see the figure of a woman. Her appearance was haunting, with pale, dirt-streaked skin and eyes hollow and dark. Her clothes were filthy and torn and clung loosely to her emaciated frame. Her bare feet, smeared with grime, and her face, sunken and ghostly, made her look almost otherworldly. As I stared in shock, she whispered in a raspy voice, asking if I had seen her baby. Her question sent a jolt of fear through me, and I barely registered her words before bolting. As I turned to leave, her voice grew louder, demanding her baby back. Clothes hangers clattered in her wake as I tore down the hallway, not daring to look back. Reaching the upstairs bathroom, I locked the door, my heart racing as I wedged my feet against it, pressing my back against the sink. The woman outside shrieked, pounding her fists against the door, her voice shifting from cries to low, animalistic growls. I managed to dial 911, my voice shaky as I described my situation to the operator. The dispatcher reassured me that help was on the way, though each second felt like an eternity as the woman's frenzied pounding continued. Finally, I heard the welcome sound of police calling out from downstairs. I yelled back, and the next few minutes were filled with the sounds of officers shouting, a struggle, and the woman's growling protests. 3 officers finally restrained her, despite her erratic, almost unnatural resistance. After the ordeal, the police suggested she was likely an individual suffering from severe mental health issues or substance abuse, though her behavior had seemed far more disturbing. I gave my statement, and my parents arrived home shortly afterward, horrified but grateful that I was unharmed. Within a month, we moved out. When I was 14, it was an average night around 9 p.m. My little cousin and I were at his house since I was babysitting while my mom and aunt were out shopping, and my dad and uncle were at the movie theater. As we sat in the living room, I began to feel an odd sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. Something was wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on it, so I tried to ignore it, hoping it would pass as we continued watching TV. Yet the feeling persisted, gnawing at me. Finally, I decided to get up and lock the back door, hoping that might ease my nerves. When I passed through the kitchen, I noticed what had set off my intuition. There, framed in the kitchen window, was a frail, ragged-looking man with a haunted gaze, staring intently at my cousin. Instantly, my protective instincts kicked in. I pretended not to notice him and told my cousin that it was time to go upstairs, mentioning that our parents would be home soon and wouldn't want him staying up too late. My real aim was to get him safely out of view. Once upstairs, I put him to bed, fully aware of the man outside who seemed to have some intention of getting in. At the time, I was about 125 pounds and stood 5 feet 8 inches, actively playing football for my school. I felt strong, but the situation was no game. I headed back downstairs, went straight into the kitchen, and grabbed a meat tenderizing hammer for protection. When I glanced back at the window where I had seen the man, he was gone. Heart racing, I sprinted to the front door and checked that both the deadbolt and knob were securely locked. I raced upstairs with my makeshift weapon, entered my cousin's room, and positioned myself in front of the door. When my cousin asked what I was doing, I calmly told him not to worry, just to keep his head down and stay under the covers. Then I dialed the police and my dad and uncle, learning the cops would take about half an hour to arrive, while my dad and uncle were still 45 minutes away. Suddenly, I heard the shattering of a window, followed by the unmistakable thud of heavy boots walking around on the main floor. I reminded my cousin to stay calm, keep quiet, and remain hidden. I could hear the intruder moving around downstairs, each step filling me with dread. Gripping the hammer, I waited tensely. About 5 minutes later, I heard the boots approaching the stairs. My heart raced as his footsteps grew louder, stopping briefly at each upstairs room, the master bedroom, then the bathroom. Mercifully, he soon turned back downstairs and eventually made his way into the basement. 15 minutes later, the police arrived, bursting into the house and sweeping each floor. They informed us that the man was actually an escaped patient from a mental hospital located a province away. One of my childhood homes had a balcony that was attached to both my mother's bedroom and mine via glass doors in each of our rooms. Next to the balcony were 2 trees. I often used to climb up and down one of them from the balcony. One night, I was reading in bed with a very dim reading light. I was about 13 and my brother and mother weren't home. I heard what sounded like something moving in one of the trees outside, but this didn't worry me as possums and bats are common in our area. Now I had thin curtains on the glass doors that separated my room and the balcony, and the doors faced out towards the street where street lamp light was always visible through my curtains. Shortly after hearing the tree rustling noises, I see a shadow slowly move past the doors, at which point I immediately turn off my reading light and freeze like a deer in headlights. The shadow is tall, so it wasn't a neighbor kid and it wasn't my 5-foot mother. The person moved slowly, creeping as though they were trying to not be noticed. They wouldn't likely be able to see into my room, but I could see them thanks to the streetlights behind them. They moved past my doors out of sight. I sat there unable to move or even think about what to do other than be absolutely still. That is, until I heard another sound. The sound of someone trying to open a glass door. That's my mom's doors to the balcony. I didn't know if she had locked them or not, but I wasn't taking chances. I moved as quickly and as silently as I could to my bedroom door and locked it. I listened for what the person was doing now, and they were still jiggling the glass door handle. It sounded like the doors weren't opening. I felt relief as this person couldn't get in. Surely, all I had to do was wait for them to realize that, and then they would leave, right? Well, I heard light footsteps move back along the balcony to my set of glass doors until I saw his shadow stop directly in front of them. Again, I froze. He couldn't see me, and he couldn't know I can see him, could he? I saw a shadow of a hand reach up to my door's handle and my heart stopped. Had I actually locked those doors myself today? I was out there earlier. What if I forgot? The seconds leading up to him grabbing the handle felt like an eternity. But thankfully, when this person tried to open the door, it did not open. It was locked. I sighed such a sigh of relief I was worried he had heard it. After this, he began pacing the length of the balcony. I didn't have a mobile and the landline was at the other end of the house, but I was scared to take my eyes off of them. I was silently crying and praying they would just leave. Then I heard him stop moving. He then said, "I could just break the glass, you know." Before I could even process this, I saw car headlights turn around the corner of my street and then stop at our property gate. My mom was home. The person on balcony moved out of sight, and I heard a loud thump as they jumped off of it. When my mom came inside, I was hysterical and was barely coherent in telling her what happened. Eventually, I got the message across, and she called the police. They never found or caught anyone, but a neighbor reported a truck in the street that matched the description of a truck that had been reported recently for attempted child abductions near my school a block away. The midsummer heat settled in as my parents left for the weekend, off to visit family at our beach house about 3 hours away. They trusted me enough to leave me alone for a couple of days, and I'd been looking forward to it. My mom had made some casserole and pasta for me to reheat whenever I wanted, and they'd left some money so I could order a pizza or anything else. I spent the first night up till 3 a.m., lost in my favorite Xbox games, then slept well into the next afternoon. When I finally woke up, I checked my phone and saw it was already past 1 o'clock. I had plans to play some pickup soccer with friends at 3, so I dragged myself out of bed and into the shower. I tend to take long showers, but when my parents aren't around, I go overboard. After about 45 minutes, lost in scrolling through Reddit and Instagram, I was jolted by the sound of our front door opening. The bathroom is located just above the main entrance, and the door has a way of creaking loudly as it swings open. Instinctively, I froze. I knew I was supposed to be alone, so I strained my ears, waiting and listening for any other sounds. There was nothing. I reassured myself that it was probably just a gust of wind, or maybe my parents had forgotten something and come back early. I turned off the shower, wrapped a towel around myself, and cautiously began descending the stairs to check it out. The staircase to the kitchen is narrow, bordered by walls on each side, making it feel like a tight tunnel. This means you can't see into the kitchen until you reach the very last few steps. As I descended, each step creaked underfoot, but I took my time, moving quietly, trying to be as stealthy as possible. I probably spent close to a minute on those dozen steps. Right before the last one, I paused, inhaling deeply to calm my nerves. I felt silly. Logically, if someone was there, I would have heard something by now. Gathering my courage, I made myself finish the descent, turning the corner into the kitchen. Standing there, only a few feet away, was a man. He stared at me, absolutely still, his expression frozen in an eerie, unnatural smile. What struck me most was not his face, but the position of his arms. They weren't relaxed at his sides but were twisted at an unnatural angle, rotated so that they nearly faced backward, with his hands lifted slightly behind him. The contorted pose was bizarre, unsettling, and instantly burned into my mind as something far from normal. I felt my heart stutter as adrenaline surged through me. Looking back, I can understand just how terrifying the moment was, but at that instant, my reaction was pure instinct. Without fully processing my own actions, I stepped forward and hit him in the jaw with as much force as I could muster, my punch landing awkwardly as a half push that sent him reeling back. I didn't wait to see his reaction. I turned, abandoning my towel in the kitchen as I bolted upstairs, locking myself in my room and propping a chair under the doorknob, just like I'd seen in movies. My hands were shaking as I called 911, my voice barely a whisper as I explained to the operator what had happened. I sat on the floor, huddled up against the door, my whole body tense with dread. Every sound seemed amplified as I listened, terrified, for any movement outside. That's when I noticed a shadow had filled the thin band of light beneath my door. He was standing just outside. A wave of terror crashed over me as I watched the faint shadow shifting slightly, signaling tiny movements that meant he was still there, just waiting. I kept still, not daring to breathe too loud, as the operator's voice from my phone continued asking if I was all right. I wanted to answer, but my throat felt tight, paralyzed with fear, and my muscles refused to obey. After what felt like an eternity, the shadow finally moved, and I heard his footsteps slowly creak away down the hall. I barely dared to move, listening as silence settled back over the house. Moments later, there was a loud banging at the front door, followed by the sound of 2 police officers entering, calling out. Relief flooded over me. I unlocked my door and practically collapsed into their presence, feeling a mixture of relief and shock. My parents never left me home alone after that incident. Even now, I make sure every lock in the house is secure before I go to bed. The nightmares still visit occasionally, especially when I'm reminded of that moment, of someone just standing silently, watching. Though the police had me work with sketch artists and went through several lineups, they never found the man. It still gives me chills whenever I catch myself looking out the window at night, half expecting to see him under a distant streetlight, still wearing that same unearthly smile. I'll never know what he wanted or even who he was. I think that will always haunt me.